Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I am Hedy Law, Associate Professor of Musicology here at UBC. Welcome to this academic year's UBC Interdisciplinary Histories Research Center Keynote lecture. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Nancy Yunhwa Rao, Professor of Music at Rutgers University. Professor Rao has researched music theory and history topics ranging from 20th century ultra-modernist American music, female composers, contemporary Chinese music and opera, Cantonese opera and Chinese opera theater in the US and Canada, Chinese opera singers, Chinese percussion music, sketch studies, music and transnationalism, Asian American music, Sino soundscape, and music and calligraphy. She has published 52 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, co-edited 2 journal colloquiums, and has 3 manuscripts under review. Her book, Chinatown Opera Theater in North America, published in 2017 by the University of Illinois Press, has been reviewed in 18 scholarly journals, received a certificate of merit from the Association for Recorded Sound Collection, and won 3 book awards granted by the American Musicological Society, Society of American Music, and the Association for Asian American Studies. Its Chinese translation was published in 2021 by Guangxi Normal University Press and Shanghai Conservatory Press. Recently, she received her 2nd National Endowment for the Humanities Research Fellowship in 2020 to 2021, which enabled her to finish another book called Transpacific Operatic Imagination, Chinese Americans in Opera. Her research raises important questions for the emerging fields of global music history, Sinophone studies, and global China. Her talk today is the first of 3 lectures this week. She will give a presentation at the UBC Rare Books and Special Collections tomorrow. On Saturday, she will give a public lecture at the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Chinese Classical Garden. The title of her talk today is Archives of the Invisible in American Music, Tracing Transpacific Crossing of Chinese Opera. Please join me and welcome Professor Nancy Rao.
Can you hear me right?
Yeah.
Thank you, Hedy, for this glorious introduction. I'm humbled because I don't know I deserve all that. But it's my great pleasure to have opportunity to share with you today my work on this particular history that has fascinated me and I've been obsessed with in the past 10 years, actually 20 years. So I shall begin. Historian Henry Yu ended his first and his important essay on Cantonese Pacific with a remarkable, beautiful sonic and musical metaphor. While we will recover the lost voices of 19th century Cantonese Pacific, while we understand that the rhythm of their lives must be understood not merely as a result of inclusion and exclusion, but as their own conscious agency and their advance to their own tunes. I learned of this phrase from Professor Yu's visit to Rutgers 10 years ago exactly. Although I never told him, I had the keen awareness at that time that what was a metaphor for him was very literal for me. The defining tunes of the Chinese diaspora in the 19th century and the early 20th century were, in the most literal sense, those of Cantonese opera. In the Americas, this was certainly the case from Victoria, Vancouver to Portland, San Francisco and Lima, Peru, and from Montreal to Boston, New York, Havana, Cuba. Their voices have been my inspiration. Yet one might ask, if this was the case, why do we hear so little about this history? Where could we locate these theaters? Who were the theater actors as well as the historical actors? Where does this history sit? And finally, why should we care about it? 5 years ago, I published a book that Hedy just mentioned. With that book, I proclaimed to, quote, release the theaters from their repressed silence and perpetual invisibility, as well as separate them from the myths about them, end quote. Trailing the footsteps of actors and actresses of the 1920s, I used a wide array of Chinese material and English materials, from Chinatown newspaper write-ups to playbills to sound recordings and a trove of photographs, from immigration papers in the U.S. National Archives to personal correspondences, reminiscences, and to scrapbook in private collection. While the focus was the 1920s, to provide a background, I sketched out the development in the 19th century and thought I had learned all that I needed to know of Chinese theaters in the 19th century. 19th century America for that book. But this was, of course, this could not have been further from the truth. The sonic imageries of the 19th century Chinese theaters were not simply kept in repressed silence. They were imprisoned by the mounting derision in historical newspaper and travelogue in English. Yet because of the paucity of Chinese language materials, these English print material constitute the primary archive of Chinese theaters in North America. That, the derision and ridicule, is the primary reason for their historical invisibility. Addressing this issue of archive is no less important than addressing the history itself. I will return to this point later. Today's lecture is divided into two parts. First, I would like to trace for you the genealogy of the Transpacific crossing of Chinese theater. In the second part, I would like to consider the archives of invisibility through issues of erasure, ridicule, listening practices, and criminalization. In the mid-19th century, more than 300,000 Chinese migrants attracted by gold rush went to the United States and British settler colonies. They were primarily residents of the coastal Guangdong area, which, as a treaty port, had a long history of vital economy. A contemporary missionary in Guangdong, Reverend William Spear, noted, when the news of gold reached them, quote, it was natural that they, above all Chinese, should rush to California, end quote. Contrary to that have been often assumed, the early immigrants to America did not flee from hunger or come from impoverished families. Rather, they were seasoned merchants or adventurous young men sent by their family who gathered materials for sending this young men for promising opportunity to pursue fortune and amass wealth. Quite a few were educated in missionary schools or were in contact with missionaries in South China. In a very short time, roots and network were established in the Pacific maritime to answer the new demand for Transpacific mobility. This is a fabulous book about that particular process. In August 1852, the daily Acta California printed a list prepared by an advisor to Chinese merchant that recorded 68 vessels arriving from China to San Francisco between January and August of that year. You can see from the making that this is drawing from the imperial network during that time. That October, the first Chinese opera troupe, Ho Fu Tang, was brought to San Francisco by one of such ship, and it's called Berkshire. Two of its managers were graduate of the missionary Morrison School in Hong Kong. So this is the advertisement they had for the October performance. And as you can see, the leadership of these three men, each of whom have actually quite a bit of prominent background, and especially the second one, Tang Tinghui, later became one of the powerful men in China. So these people were prominent in the Chinese community in San Francisco, and when the first anti-Chinese kind of bill was discussed and delivered by the governor, they stood up to the governor, Yogler, and these are the things in the long letters they wrote publicly to. So I show this letter just to give a sense of the people that brought Chinese theaters to the United States were the primary leadership of the Chinese community. So, the early Chinese immigrants established Chinese opera theater on the grand scale. Let's go back to this advertisement. The first troupe had 123 performers. On October 18th, the troupe gave the first fully staged Cantonese opera performance at this American theater in San Francisco. They opened the performance with a traditional opener, the joint investiture of Prime Minister of Sixth World. Sixth World becomes one of the most performed Cantonese opera in 19th century. The troupe's names were, as you can see, spelled in a variety of different names. So it's added a difficulty for the researchers, obviously. In any case, what is important is this. It was only a year and a half after the first fully staged European opera production in that particular city. And as you can see, I marked here the prices for these two performances are actually the same. And in 1852, the Cantonese opera production were the only fully staged opera to perform in San Francisco in that whole year. So you can imagine the excitement for San Francisco to have such a full production of opera and draw attention. So for a full week, the whole town troupe performed different operas every evening. And 2 months later, they built their own theater with construction materials brought themselves, which is not uncommon because California, as you can imagine at that time, was really relying on such import for building material. And they performed in that theater for 3 months before they sold the theater and headed east to perform, appearing in New York in 1853. Therefore, in the mid-1850s, these two types of opera troupes each made their way across the continent, though in opposite directions. From New York, Italian opera companies traveled toward the western frontier. Going the other direction, Cantonese opera troupe began in San Francisco and moved eastward toward New York City. In subsequent decades, these two types of troupes had very different trajectory, obviously, whereas European opera evolved to become the staple of cultural institutions such as the Metropolitan Opera Theater or San Francisco Opera. The fate of Chinese theater was far more complicated. In the second half of the 19th century, Cantonese opera troupes appeared regularly on the Pacific coast, and Chinese theater were built one after another from the port cities to the hinterland. During the years that California developed its agriculture, fishing, mining, and constructed the infrastructure such as railroads and dams, a significant portion of the workforce came from Chinese workers, contractors, suppliers, businessmen. Providing for these immigrants, the Chinese opera troupes also formed a network reaching deep into the interior of the states. They created an active circuit of Chinese opera performances. The presence of Chinese theaters could be found to circulate all through the mining towns and agricultural development in Northern California. In large port cities such as San Francisco and Victoria, British Columbia, there were multiple Chinese theaters built in local vicinity of one another. You can see in this one, there are 4 theaters just less than 1 block away from each other. And that is built between 68 and 79. And this one is actually from British Columbia. In Victoria, the theaters is all I could find on the map that were in such close vicinity. But newspaper actually report up to 5 Chinese theaters that actually appear over the late 19th century. So these were ambitious endeavors. First of all, each of these theaters in San Francisco set between 1,000 and 2,600 audiences. And second of all, the third theater in San Francisco was built in 1877 using the most modern technology of the time and was designed by the same architects who designed the new City Hall for San Francisco. When in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in the US Congress and signed into law, prohibiting all Chinese laborers from entering the United States, Chinese theaters were undeterred, putting on opera performances every day. So throughout the second half of the 19th century, Chinese merchants invest in Chinese theaters. As you can see, they not only recruit troops and construct Chinese theater buildings, but also manage with a mixture of savvy operation and political skill to address political raids and legal obstacles. Their endeavors, investment, and resilience sustained the theater over the decades. Theater was supported earnestly by these kinship associations and business organizations. Businessmen hire opera performers for a variety of reasons and institution stability. So it's a way for them to ingratiate themselves with the communities and establish legitimacy to present offerings and to celebrate birthday of all sorts of patrons for auspicious purpose. And most importantly, to draw from the energy of the bustling of people, thereby enhancing the prosperity of the business. Cantonese opera performance was, as scholar Visual Hu noted, quote, the kind of magical religious blessing that performance is thought to confer on communities, end quote. Chinese theater in the 19th century, therefore, represented Chinese immigrants' important strategy to develop the cultural and social infrastructure essential to the operation of their migration. It was where worship, commerce, and entertainment converge. For this reason, we find many situations where theaters were managed to be built right across the Joss house or temple, just like how they would perform in southern China. And this is an example from Victoria, BC, and this is an example later from Los Angeles. My study shows that while anti-Chinese hostility increased phenomenally and laws after laws on Chinese exclusion passed at the Congress and extend its power, in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, the discourse about Chinese theater in mainstream society also strangely proliferated. Magazines published long articles about the theaters. Celebrities visit theaters as part of the important party. And artists make significant painting about actors. So this is the time circulation toward the end of the 19th century, and they're very busy maritime, bringing the troops over continually. So the theater were constantly renewed with new performers. And this is one of the most important articles in the late 19th century about Chinese theaters. And as you can see, it's a marvelous portrait of a Chinese actor and very sensitive rendition of their dramatic power. And this is a close study in Boston about their performance as well. And on the right, you can see it moved into fashion as well. So in the late decade of 19th century, elements of Chinese opera also began to have clear imprint in American popular entertainment, experimental theater, concert music, and contemporary opera. And here's an example. Twentieth was a opera that came from the Bohemian Club Grove play from 1917. And as you can see, it actually has the distinction of being the first America performed in Europe. And it was on the Chinese story with a lot of Chinese props, and it's sung in French. So go figure the linguistic complexity in it all. And after Monte Carlo successful performance, it was brought back to San Francisco. After the 20th century, the stage light in Chinese theater was dimmed after 1906. Earthquake and fire that destroyed San Francisco Chinatown, and more severe Chinese exclusion measures stopped Chinese actors from entering America altogether. But Chinese theater continued in Victoria and Vancouver. As an excellent record of this prosperity is kept at the Vancouver City Archive. First of all, we can see the Chinese theater that the famous Ibsen built in Shanghai Valley. I hope one day a photograph of this theater will surface. Just as several boxes of powders for Chinese opera performances was uncovered during renovation of his company. And that was in the 70s, and they're now in collection at the Vancouver City Museum. But the complete business record of another theater company in the 1916-18 is probably the most fascinating. It is such a wonderful, rich collection at the City Archive. Both Wing-Chun and I have written about the theater, which is called, I think in the next page will give you the name. In Chinese, it's Yukon Company. Although both Wing-Chun and I have written about it, speaking for myself, I know I barely touch the surface of this very, very rich material, and the story is waiting to be told. I wish I lived in Vancouver. I studied the daily receipt, and from them you can see the extent of the influence of this company. This may be a bit hard to show, but what I show is 4 evenings of ticket sale. And on the top one, you can see that particular opera sold more than 1,000 tickets. And to the next layer, you can see on the slow night, it has 500 or so audiences. And the bottom one, you can see 2 performances that also have quite a number of audiences. And I want to add that this is one of the 3 theaters that were in Vancouver during that time. They kind of hop between Vancouver and Victoria, but continuing performing in Vancouver. And you can trace their steps in the Chinese Time, the local Chinese newspaper. So there's a lot to study with this particular history, but we'll skip that. But I want to add, in the 1920s, there's a renaissance of Cantonese opera theaters in North America, and that started in Vancouver. As I discussed, the golden era started with this troupe called Le Wan Nian. Through this active network, Canada enjoyed even more outstanding performance of Cantonese opera. And so this is Le Wan Nian that began at Vancouver and moved down to San Francisco and established there. And here's another one that actually is on its way to Portland. And from there, you can see that there's a whole network that's performing there, right? And it's active network kind of feedback then to Canada, such that you have something like this in Toronto Daily Star, where they feature an actress and have a feature article about her. And that's another actress that I talk about in my book. So this is Li Shifang, and one of the performers I like to talk about a lot and analyze somewhat in my book. Here's a little bit of its sound. Every time I listen to this recording, I have in my head a Chinese that grew up in this particular country and wanted to sound like that because that's such a beautiful sound of the voice. Okay, here's another performer. His name is Bai Zhirong, one of the most famous male singer, and this is a very signature opera of his as well. Recording from the 1920s and 30s, and they're very different from the kind of Cantonese opera performance and accompaniment today. But there's a trend to kind of, go visit these historical recording now and try to reproduce this type of historical performance or a traditional style in Cantonese opera. So that's the extent to which that I think the history is very, very clear in showing the vibrancy of this Cantonese opera culture in North America. And the map from April Liu's book on Cantonese opera costume showed the extensive Transpacific network of the flow of the troops and performance back and forth between China and North America. The crossing, the Transpacific crossing of Chinese opera performance constitute the Transpacific history of American music. Transpacific studies, which has proliferated in the areas of comparative literature, English, cultural studies, sociology, political science, business, and history, has not been a focus of music scholarship. To be sure, in the study of American music history, specifically, the Transpacific perspective has rarely received any attention. Why not? It can be because we continue to see American music only narrowly as an extension of European music tradition, or continue to equate the history of American music exclusively with the history of concert music or written compositions. On the contrary, in recent decades, we have seen the expansion of scholarship in American music to include many types of music in the areas of vernacular music, popular music, and improvisations. It can be because the Transpacific is important to America, or that it requires no special attention because Asian Americans are no longer regionalized. On the contrary, scholarship have shown how the Pacific Rim region has had a significant impact in nation building, while Asian Americans have suffered still from various forms of racial discrimination and violence throughout American history. The denigrating racial and gendered stereotypes about them have persisted from the 19th century to the present, everywhere in illustrations, songs, movies, and crimes. So how is it then that the Transpacific, so entangled with the history of America, so ubiquitous part of our culture, and so easily recognizable as a phenomenon of our society, should at the same time remain so absent, a black hole in the conceptual framework about American music history? The reason has to do with a particular identity of perpetual foreignness, alienness, and objectification associated with Asian Americans. Therefore, it has been taken for granted that the music from the Pacific Rim region is of no import to American music history. That is why materials of Chinese American music have not been collected in institutional archives, and that its history remains no more than a footnote in the historiography of American music. To document and reconstruct this Transpacific history of America, that is, to focus on the condition of their existence, the making of the theaters, and that which constitute the theater experience, is also to rethink some of our most basic assumptions about American music history, about agency, about personhood, about what kind of music life can count. In the Orientalism of Edward Said offer us a powerful tool of critique. I hope the Transpacific perspective offers us a framework to conceptualize the being, such as the being of Chinese theater in America. The materiality, the theatricality, the performativity, and the musicking, the lamenting, the joy, the emotion of agency. That is, both to know objectively the history and to imagine and empathize with the inhabitants of the community and the performers of the theaters subjectively. I use the word imagine a lot because sometimes that is the most effective tool and the only tool. Scholars of Transpacific history of American music are inevitably faced with the limit of archives. As one scholar put it in quite a matter-of-fact way, quote, "Those regular archives were not established to collect our type of music history," end quote. In writing the history of Chinatown theater's history in the 1920s, I relied on not the official archive, but artifact rescued from the dumpsters on the street, which is how some amazing photographs and playbills of the 1920s survived. Government surveillance of Chinese theaters and actors, which was conducted for the purpose of minimalizing Chinese immigration. Folded yellow playbills in script pool under someone's bed. At the same time, however, I would add, these were not simply history props or documents. How they were produced, exchanged, and used were just as interesting. As a material culture, they were objects through which theater culture were created, shaped, and disseminated. Exploring them as objects lead us to a wide range of questions concerning social network, human transactions, economic conditions, and human agencies. Delineate the symbolic and the cultural meanings that these objects carry, the social works that they generated, and the individuals they connected is very important. In pursuing these questions, we can understand and explore the way people live their lives through, by, around, in spite of, in pursuit of, in denial of, and because of. While objects are available for 20th century theater, the situation, in fact, is far more bleak for the 19th century. As I alluded to, English newspaper and travelogues provides just about the only account of Chinese theater in America. There one would encounter, as I have always read it, mountains of reports with ridiculous of Chinese music in extreme terms. Noise ordinance targeted at Chinese theaters and derisons of Chinese musicians' criminal behavior for violating these noise ordinance. They give the impression of the journalist entering a competition as to who could write the most outrageous condemnations. The vibrant life of Chinese theater has since been imprisoned in this report, chock full of ridiculous. It was nearly impossible to excavate a detailed understanding of Chinese music alive from these ridiculous. Even worse, for some people, even those who have good intention to resurrect this history, these denigrating reports served as evidence justifying the invisibility of Chinese in American music history. And there's also the criminalization of the sound. In 1880, Chinese theater performance was lively in Sacramento. The theater attracted attention from the beginning of the year, and in February it was offering 2 daily performances. In June, however, complaints were made of its ceaseless ding and unearthly kettlebell during the night. So 8 performers were arrested. Since the Chinese theater will have obtained the license from the state, county, and city, giving them the privilege and protection to operate the theater, the performers had to be released. A week later, the theater reopened, but again, actors and musicians were arrested, this time the whole troupe and the proprietor. At the police court, it was declared that, quote, the evidence introduced to prove the theater to be a nuisance showed that the noise from it had been so loud and unusual character, end quote. Upon appeal, the Superior Court sustained the judgment of the lower court. The judge's decision was, quote, a license was duly issued by the proper officer to the proprietor of the establishment to conduct a theater. The word theater is one having a well-understood meaning, and almost any person of ordinary intelligence would readily understand the implication of a permit to have a theater. The law does not authorize conducting of a Chinese theater, but merely permit a license for theater, end quote. The judge went further to group the offensive sound with immoral or obscene exhibitions such as nudity, and opined that a license for theater issued under law is not intended in any case to be an indulgence. That was a quote. The judge identified both the temper and the dissonance of the sound and the auditory discomfort it caused the surroundings as evidence of its criminality. Under the identification of the unlawfulness, Chinese sound had no claim to legitimacy, nor did its musical space. The theater's music, categorized as nuisance and noise, was targeted for silencing and punished by the state. But Nina Eichheim, the author of The Race of Sound, teaches us listening is always already a critical performance, that is, a political act. And the voices heard are ultimately identified, recognized, and named by the listener at large. Essentially, listener is the originator of meaning. In an era when an anti-Chinese agenda grew from state politics of California to become the national political platform, the white listening practice was largely attuned to anti-Chinese politics. The reportage of ridicules and caricatures was essentially an act of erasure, and they continued to work at effacement in an insidious way. The archive also structure and frame how we enter into the present and future, as Catherine McKittrick recently wrote in a wonderful book. Indeed, the regionalized listening practice of 19th century America established a ranking of musical sound and worth that has yet to be undone. Therefore, to excavate the sound of Chinese theater in 19th century America from these archives is to commit ourselves to what historian Celia Hartman called listening for the unsaid, translating misconstrued words and refashioning disfigured life, end quote. In other words, it is to imagine, however fragmented and vaguely constituted, of Chinese theaters from the vantage point of the inhabitant of the theater, including the vocalizers. It is to write against the grain. For each derisive account of Chinese theater's music in news report and magazines, there was a vibrant, lively evening of opera performance. For each arrest of Chinese musicians violating city ordinances by the simply performing music, there was a full house of Chinese immigrants mesmerized by the fantastic world of opera performance. For each complaint of noise brought before cities' governing boards, there was an opera troupe offering a full-fledged production. The music of Chinese theater has its roots in a long and popular tradition. From the mid-19th century to around 1930s, Chinese theater entertained hundreds and thousands of people night after night. They brought in star performers, and they, think about the performance day in, day out with the help of records. And even though we don't have reports from that time about their reception, we can draw from two famous writers in Hong Kong and Singapore about how they truly could enjoy and enter into the world of Cantonese opera performance. So in most general terms, to write the history of Chinese theater in North America is to consider an imaginative making. Against the meta-narrative of American music, this history may often appear to be sketchy or utterly irretrievable. But it is here that we need to intervene, both with our work in archives and with our imaginations as writers, readers, and musicians. In this respect, Yu-Teng Huang, the author of Transpacific Imaginations, offers a useful framework, namely, it is to create historical knowledge, quote, where knowledge is replaced by acknowledgement and cognition. We might think of issues related to Transpacific perspective or the music history of Chinese America as belonging to another era. But they are not. They belong to the current affair as well. In recent decades, groups and individuals from the Pacific realms, in particular East Asia, have come to shape music environment, trends, and production in America. Together, these individuals and groups have made their own significant intervention to the old ranking of musical sound and worth that have persisted since the 19th century. Their work elicits a kind of resistance, or not, but with a full acknowledgement of the significance of a history of the Transpacific connection, we can better trace and conceptualize the various materials and the recursive ways that the music has circulated, produced, and interact in American music in various ways of musicking and cultural production, in the past and also in the present and future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Question, comments, suggestions, criticism? And so, sharing, for example, we have some time. Yeah, Alex.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a third year student. I was wondering, when you read the noise ordinances as evidence of history. It was an emotional experience, just trying to process it and understand the past.
Yeah, so here's a bit of a personal history. As a historian, I am a historian in some ways. As a historian, I collect material, right? So when I first started collecting materials for Chinese theaters, I run into those ridiculous and I skip them. I don't collect them because I don't acknowledge them. It just seems wrong to have that in my possession because it makes me embarrassed. It hurts, to read those, right? And I did that for a long time. And I think that's the reason a lot of people don't study 19th century Chinese, theater in North America, because that's all you can read. There's nothing else to do. You read those, So only after I finishing this book, I start to return and start to look at those material with a fresh eye. That I start to think, wait a second, these were written for a particular purpose, right? And they are in some ways act of violence, right? Act of violence in basically eradicating the accomplishments of music culture of someone else. And the thing is, there's so much of it, and they're just everywhere, and you cannot escape it. And what I start to realize is that I will read some books that try to talk about the Chinese theaters or talk about the ethnic influence in theatrical kind of production in the 19th century, but they will quote those ridiculous as fact, right? As the fact of how these theaters were. They're noisy, they're terrible, they're worse than anything. It colored the scholars, even though scholars who want to write ethnic influence into history. So not until we start to understand what the meaning is, what kind of listening practice really where the meaning comes from and how that has nothing to do with the source of the music, that we can start to separate the two. So yeah, myself, I went through a whole lot of time looking at only material that I think are useful and throw away those that I just think it was racist. But then I follow the lead of African American scholars who write about slavery, write about erasure of these people, and I start to see what I was doing, that I skipped the opportunity to do a good understanding of what that really truly means, right? So I actually just wrote a piece called the listening practice, the practice of listening archive. And that's for a symposium on Nina Etcherheim's work. So I think the mic frame is very important in how you read this material. And few today can pick up those ridiculous and feel good about it. We don't feel good about it when we read that kind of stuff, right? Wherever you come from. But what we need to read is what goes into the construction of such listening. So that's where I stand now, and I feel, it's a good thing to be aware of, and that's how I take my students through some of the materials as well.
Thank you.
That was convenient. Thank you, Alex. Mary, I learned so much. It was so great. Lots of fascinating details, but also a remarkable and inspiring method. So I really thank you for that.
Thank you.
I had a question, sort of looking at the slide that you talked about with the Italian opera and then the Chinese operatic troupe. And the prices, I think, for the 1850s, $4, that would be a lot, right? So I guess I'm trying to understand in these really big theaters that you're talking about, like the American Theater, I think it's 2,000 people. Who are the people in the crowd, and how expensive an evening out is it for them? Is it just routine, I'm paying for gold, I have some spare time, or is it, I'm so excited that this troupe has come from where I'm from, and I'm going to take the whole family out, and it's very expensive for me. So I guess it's a question about, is it mass culture, is it elite culture at that time?
Thank you for that question. I think it's, truth be told, I think that whole year, there's not a single opera production. And this is the only opera production. So even though several months ago, the governor has declared, anti-Chinese kind of statement, it's still, the city is still very excited for opera production to appear. And second of all, I think the opera production is very interesting. I want to go back to this slide, where you can see that the price change, from the most expensive to the cheapest. But you see, the pricey ones are only few. The majority, or whether or not the theater makes money, depends on how many of the lower price tickets they sell, right? And that fluctuates greatly, right? So in this one, you can see we have some 700 tickets sold that evening. And this one, we have only like 276 sold. So it was really not just for elite. Elite stays, there, and the other are not. In the 1860s, 1879 or so, around that time, it was 10 cents. It was 10 cents for anyone to go in. And I read about how that's about how much you would pay for a cheap meal for 10 cents to go to a Chinese theaters. And that's a cheap ticket, obviously. And another thing that I think that's really hard for us to imagine is the lack of shared entertainment, right? So if you look through the playbills or advertisements of San Francisco in 1952 and 1852, you will see that it's mostly English drama, it's mostly concerts. So if you want music, you have most commonly, concert, especially soprano. There's several quite famous soprano that brought, tour around very, very successfully. But theater, whole production, drama on stage, it was a thing to see. Yeah. So that's why I think it is very important to also take account of the hinterland, right? So in the mining area, there's a lot of Chinese theater just built and performed and so on and so forth. And that history is what I'm trying to work on. And if you think San Francisco has very, spotty elements to work with, the mining town is almost zero, right? But we know they're there because of the reports. So so theater is really amazing 19th century, I think.
May I offer a word of academic comfort and familiarity? I'm very glad you have kept those terrible reviews. They are immensely familiar to me as a conductor of new music of the 21st century. The same language, the same incoherence, the same bellicosity, not perhaps racially motivated, but assuredly orally motivated, for those profoundly uncomfortable with sounds different from anything they have heretofore experienced. In that sense, what you have documented here is intensely and admirably familiar for this particular. May I recommend a book to every student here? It was written by the great musicologist Nikolai Slonimsky. I'm sure you know his name. And Slonimsky, one of our great writers, put together a book called The Lexicon of Musical Invective. And he went back in time, as you have done in these times, and he looked at reviews from premieres of work by such unknowns as Beethoven, Berlioz, Wagner, and Stravinsky. They were ghastly. They were like this. They culminated on the ways in which, according to the reviewer, Beethoven was surely insane.
If I may interject there,
Yes, please.
I think there's a big difference.
Okay.
When this was written like this, it's not just about the music, it's about the people.
Oh, indeed. That's
So-
the racist element that comes through so clearly in what you're talking about.
So therefore, it really is a complex issue in the sense that it perpetuates the kind of denigrating stereotype about Chinese community, right? So when those people come to Chinese theater and they render this type of description, and then populate this notion of Chinese theaters, they're not doing just to the music, all the theater, they're doing to the whole ethnic group, right? So that further worsen the racism. So it's an act of violence. That's why I, kind of put it that way. But thank you for your remark.
Well, I think that's utterly legitimate, and if it is comfort, you will see in the lexicon of musical invective very nearly identical language, terms, and hysteria. Alas, this has confronted all of us in music for hundreds of years. In this instance that you particularized today, there is an element of undisguised racist malignity.
Yes, agree. It's not only a disguise, it's outright.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
It's outright.
It's
So.
absolutely. That's
Thank
what
you.
have to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you.
Charles, do you like to talk about the opera Chinatown that you're?
Oh, this is where our guest is not to be.
Well, you know what? This may be a very good way to talk about it in a little bit, maybe. Okay.
Hi, I have two questions, if that's okay. First, did we see a rise in the amateur practice of Chinese opera amongst Chinese people when the troops from China weren't able?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of what you said.
Did we see a rise in the amateur practice of Chinese opera amongst Chinese people when the troops from China weren't able to visit?
Is that the first question, or do you have a second?
That's the first question.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I think there's a amateur performers in the group. It was very much lively. So one of the things I talk about in my book is that in the 1920s, right, when the troops start to become really vibrant and they, perform different operas every night, and at the beginning, it was the performers, the actors and actresses were receiving, the significant billing. And then toward the middle or late 1920s, it switched a little bit, such that the dramatist, and the producer, and also musicians received head billings. And one of the reasons for the performers, musicians, like people who played hooting or, it's because they became part of the music making scene in Chinatown. They perform together with amateur people, and they also perform in various different functions in Chinatown communities. So yeah, so it becomes more lively with actually with the rise of Chinese theaters, right, and also phonograph records were an important part of it as well.
And if I may, my second question is, what do you think the future of Chinese opera in North America looks like?
It's a bit complicated because I think the Chinese theaters I'm talking about was, before the time of radio, sound films, and TV. right? So I was talking to a class this afternoon about this afternoon, in that at that time, the entertainment was very limited. So Chinese opera was an important form of entertainment. People go there both as a kind of community gathering place, because they didn't have a Starbucks, or a way to kind of again get the relaxation that they would otherwise have no way of getting. And that's why I think it was likely that they were able to sustain such, different programming every night, because you have audience. So we see from this one that even and this is daily, right? So this theater in Vancouver left us with daily record. So we get to see on the worst night, you still have some 273 people there or so, right? Whatever numbers. So they're there to enjoy it. And today, I just don't think it's the same. The entertainment is so varied, and people have many different ways to occupy their time. And so it's not the only way. And also a lot of things move virtual, right? People can enjoy things on YouTube and stuff like that. So I think it's a different story. And as a form of performance, it's also has its struggle in various different locations. So it is different. But I think as a part of American history, it was unique during that period of time. Thank you.
That's okay. I can speak about it. Thank you. First of all, I really learned a great deal on my
Thank you.
So happy I came. So I wish I knew more about what I want to ask about, but maybe you do. I'm just wondering about in that period of history, maybe a little bit later, if we have evidence of other immigrant art forms that received critique of the kind you're talking about. I would presume they each have their own particular flavors of racism. I was wondering if maybe particular Japanese communities, how they were treated, if differently, if similar, and it would be an interesting sort of comparative genealogy of racist discourse.
I think so. I really do think so. So I wrote that piece on the listening practice in archive. And I present that, I shared that piece last November with a group in North Carolina. And there are several, people who read the piece said that they echo with it. They didn't tell me specifically, but they echo with it. But they were, scholars in, Latin American music in America and so on and so forth. So I think that kind of listening practice was common, among several, as a receiving end of that kind of listening practice. I think there are several of them. And we all know that in Europe, right, we have a big, huge kind of ridicule about Chinese music, right? And this is well documented. And even the Paris exhibition has generated a lot of that kind of remark on the Vietnamese opera, which was very similar to Chinese opera to begin with.
I guess I'm thinking of the Mikado too.
I'm sorry?
The Mikado. That was a different kind of mockery, but
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, that just makes me think about all this.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the case. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Kristen. Just hopefully a quick curiosity question in case you have that information. Just looking at the discrepancy of the prices of the different class tickets. The first class tickets don't look to be excruciatingly more expensive than the other classes.
Right.
And I was just wondering how much of you mentioned Starbucks and the absence of that kind of hangout. which is a great point of social interest to like, because in Paris when the opera house was open, it was very much like, if you look at the architecture, I don't know how the setup is like for the theaters here. They were constructed and designed in such a way that the people who attended the operas could be seen. They would have precisely, the space and the staircases to show off their beautiful dresses and stuff. So to what degree, and it's basically because I come into this without any understanding of this.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent is this like a social symbol? Of course, if you can't make ends meet, you wouldn't pay for any kind of ticket to see an opera, but
Right.
just to have an idea of the possibility of it being a status symbol versus social.
Right, right. Thank you. I wish I knew more about it. I think in the 19th century American society, it definitely is like what you said, right? So you saw the famed performance over here. You see, that's a performance, right? And it is in a grand opera kind of situation, and in the boxes, there are all these people. This is the San Francisco Chronicle. It talks about all this elite, right? So we don't have something like that, documented in the Chinese theater. We just don't. But one thing I'll share with you is my reading of this. So this actually comes from something that looks like this. So this is a business receipt, and it shows the number of tickets sold of each price. This is from pseudo number. They have a particular numbering system. And so from this, it shows however, what type of ticket are sold in what way. But we go back to this, you will see that the number of seats sold for first class doesn't change very much, right? And I guess this is a lot, but this is still kind of about the same. So I sometimes wonder, someone really needs to do a thorough study. I only write about an article on this. I have not really dig into it as much as I would have loved to. But someone should do a study about who these people are, because we can understand we probably have record about the merchants who organized this group. And we probably can understand what those people are and whether those people go to the theater daily. And I think to the extent that this is a kind of daily box that they basically bought, for the whole season, I don't know what is necessary for them to do showiness as such, right? It's kind of like entertainment for the family. And that's why he's saying, have that whole theater built just in his kind of back door, right? So I think it's kind of different models probably. And also, even though I show this on the stage, I sometimes wonder with this top ticket, right? Whether they just sold as a matter of, subscription series kind of thing, right? And whether people show up or not is a different story, for those rich people. So I think the audience definitely is a really complex issue here. But I think the most important lesson I take from this is that it's just such an important activity for the whole community. And everybody were there to gain the, enchantment evening that they can get. And to think about that and to understand the ways in which that constitute the psyche of those people. I think it's very, very, very important for us in terms of understanding the history. Because one of the things that's difficult for this study is that in terms of American music, of course, it hadn't really starting to gain some recognition, but still has not been considered part. And in terms of Asian American history or Canadian Chinese history, they also don't think music constitutes an important part of the history. They think, the business, just, the ways in which theater comes from the important part of people's lives has not risen to the level of historical significance for a lot of people. And I think it should, because it says a lot, right? So one thing I think is fabulous about this group of things in this Yonghang company as City Archive is that it tells us exactly what opera was performed. And that's fabulous, because if we can know that, then we can know a lot more about the makeup of their mindset. So for example, in that, I think it has a lot less of those civil opera. It's still more of this kind of, opera that, so Cantonese opera earlier on was more fully cast in the sense that you have this warrior, the middle age, these are important characters. And those, beauty or actresses, that kind of the female role, they were not very important. They became only more important toward the end of the 1920s, and then influenced by the Hollywood and so on and so forth. They become more of the type of operas that everyone liked to see. But before that, it was a different type of opera that attracted people's attention. So yeah, it's just, the history is fascinating to me. So I'm so happy to be able to answer these questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. I learned a lot. So I have a curiosity about the evolution and the transformation, if any, that these theater took after the Transpacific relocation. Like, do they kind of develop a distinct identity compared to, for instance, the theater troupe that did not move, that remained in the Chinese government? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. In the 19th, 20th century, it's mostly male performers on stage, right? That's to have the male and female performing together on stage was considered, a taboo, right? And the government banned it. So in 20th century, the troops were performing still that way in China until 1930s. But in America, it actually began that practice of male and female sharing the same stage a lot earlier. So I would say even in the 1910s, it began to have these kind of co-ed performances. And I suspect one of the ways that it became legitimized in China, both Guangzhou and Hong Kong, has something to do with the fact that it first got started in overseas, in North America, for example. In fact, some of the actresses, one particular actress was the leading force in doing that in Hong Kong, and she first performed in America with a famous actor, for a long period of time. And then in the 1930s, she became one of the first ones to perform with men on stage. So I think there's a kind of going back and forth. Another thing that, aside from the kind of role type, is also the singing voice. It's often said that the singing voice becomes less high-pitched and more natural because the ways that it, several performers that had North American experiences brought it back to China. So there's some theories about that. We can't confirm that, but there's a kind of a back and forth there as well. And I think in many ways, what I read so far of 19th century performance on stage, I feel that they're doing things that I can't imagine they're doing in China. For example, in one particular report, I read about a wood boat being, on stage, and the performers steered the boat in a particular way on stage for a performance and there's a report that writes about it, very meticulously to show the maneuver. And that's just not the kind of things that you read in Chinese about Cantonese opera performance in 19th century. I really have not encountered that. And one last thing I would say is that in North America, they can't help but performing in theater, right? So, but in China, they perform in a lot of different type of settings. So a lot of times they just build this kind of temporary stage across from a temple and perform for days, right? And people actually didn't have to pay to see, right? This performance for deities, right? So people don't have to pay for it. So this kind of open stage performance was much more common in China. And so when these troops come to North America, they perform in theaters. They whether it's a theater that has four walls like a built like this, or it's a theater that has more rudiment structure like in the mining field, they perform in theaters. So I think I have no proof of it, but I'm wondering whether this kind of experience of performing in the theater in North America somehow get brought back to China, where performing in open field is much more common, was still the case. So I think there's a lot of work there to be done, but definitely the performance practices are to some extent different, just because the different audience demand and social context. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Professor Rao. This is Irving from Theater Studies. So, yeah, I have two questions. So, the first one is regard to the pinyin system. So, I noticed that the first, Kung Fu Tang or this one, Yonghang, the pinyin system is more like Cantonese pinyin system. But there is one Le Wan Nian show, it's in 1906 or something. But that was the Mandarin pinyin. So I'm just wondering if there are any tensions between the Mandarin-speaking community and the Cantonese-speaking communities in terms of who sponsor these troops to travel or others, or just probably I just over-interpretation.
Yeah, language is a very, very fascinating aspect to deal with in this Cantonese opera theater here. Because as we know, Cantonese immigrants were the majority, right, who came to North America. But there are different dialects spoken in the Cantonese community. And so Taishanese is also another language. So I was discussing with this Singapore theater scholar about just whether it's possible at all for this Cantonese opera performers to use Taishan dialect on stage. He doesn't think it's possible. He thinks that this training for Cantonese opera is really just Cantonese opera. And the Taishanese was different. So his reaction was, they won't know how to use Taishanese on stage. It's just a different kind of dialect. But the thing is, Cantonese opera was enjoyed in that larger region that I showed at the beginning of the talk, right? So this larger region spoke different dialects, but there's only one Cantonese opera, right? So they share enough. They share enough of similarity, and on top of that, we all know that these are historical legend and familiar stories, so they don't really need a whole lot to understand what's happening on stage. So that's the only explanation. As for Mandarin dialect, so Cantonese opera as a form of opera genre actually is a combination of the local Cantonese troops and then the northern. And so for the longest time, up till 1920s, the arias, so-called arias in it, were performed using the northern dialect. So they call Zhongzhouyin. So it's very similar to the Mandarin Chinese. And even in that Li Xuefang excerpt that I played, what she sang was was Zhongzhou, so it's very similar to Mandarin theater. And in my document, I faced the difficulty of whether to use, Mandarin romanization or Cantonese romanization. They're all Cantonese opera troupes. So ideally, one would use, Cantonese kind of romanization. But the problem is that there's several different kinds, and also a lot of them were, just used for like immigration documents. So they're hodgepodge way of romanizing them, right? So it becomes a really, really in terms of documentation. So several friends of mine and I kind of talk about this, and we decide, and I think it's shared by some companies or some studies related to Canton area, in that we just use pinyin, Hanyu pinyin, to have them. So the reason I use 乐万年, so my approach to the use of document is this. I would use the romanization that's in the historical document. And they typically come from Cantonese. And for those that do not have an existing, romanization, I use Mandarin. So in my book, I have a glossary for people to kind of, check one against the other. And that's kind of compromise. 乐万年 is one that I didn't find any kind of English depiction of that particular theater. In fact, that theater it seems to me just the name of the theater, and in actuality, it's composed of two troupes. Each troupe has, its own name. And so, yeah, in my book, I did talk about the difficulty of trying to pin down what troupe and what theater and how they change. It's a mess. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the answer. And the second question is about the repertoire. So I'm interested that, did you find any civilized drama, like 文明戏, being performed in North America?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, do you think that have some like relationship with political situation, especially like, for example, probably some repertoire related to 1911's revolutionary of ROC, that kind of.
And sorry, what's the last part of what you said?
So like, do you think it's related to probably like propaganda of 1911 revolutionary in Republic of China, or is that just for like charity performance?
Really interesting you ask that question, because, okay, so in my book I talk about how after 1906 the theater basically stopped existing because they cannot come, and the old one was burned away, right? So there weren't any kind of professional performance, but there was an amateur troupe that performed in Oakland, California. And that troupe actually advocate for the 1911 revolution. So that did have that kind of a role. And when the 1920s, the theater opened again and had daily production and things like that, they perform a range of different operas. So they have the traditional kind of, a drama, and drama such that's actually even shared by other opera genre, right? Just the famous stories, like Madame Whitesnake kind of stories. And there's also the contemporary stories. So there's one about the kidnapping of Sun Yat-sen in London. There's a Cantonese opera about that. And there's also one about, a son come all the way from China to look for his father in US and disguised as a woman to test whether his father is still loyal to his mother. So there's anyone who knows that that's a rip-off of the Xue Pingui story, right? So in that Xue Pingui story, there's this returned warrior who saw slipper in front of his wife's bed, and therefore, suspect that his wife was, not loyal to him, and therefore he found ways to test his wife, and so on and so forth. So a lot of treats like that, and Cantonese opera is fun because of that. It's just, so a whole range of opera was performed, and I think you can really feel for the theater, because they rarely repeat. One opera doesn't repeat until after 4 or 5 months. Even opera is repeated like, in 2 months. It must be something greatly popular. So they have, I don't know where they find all the stories, but they did. And they string together various different type of things to make stories. So, thank you.
Okay, so I think this is it. So I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce Charles Barber. And so, why don't you say something about the Chinatown Opera?
Yes, please.
Is it okay?
Yes,
Please do, because this is the audience.
Right.
City Opera, the company for which I serve as artistic director, has commissioned a new opera called Chinatown. We give its world premiere in September at the Vancouver Playhouse. I hope you will all come. I'm so pleased that you talked about Taiwanese, because when we began in our ignorance 5 years ago, we presumed that the secondary language of our show would be Cantonese. But as is our practice at City Opera, we took it to public workshops in Chinatown. Hundreds of people came to the text and to the piano vocal versions of those workshops. And many of the elders said, well, you mean well, but you're not doing well. Our ancestors didn't speak Cantonese, they spoke Taisan, or Maisan. And then someone piped up and said, Haka. Our librettist is the fabulous Canadian writer Madeleine Thiam, whose work, Do Not Say We Got It, it's a masterpiece. It won the Geller Prize, it won the Governor General's Award. This is Maddie's first opera. Our composer is Alice Ping Ho. This is Alice's third opera. And she is similarly awarded and honored and esteemed. The cast consists of 18 persons, 6 leads, and a 12-man chorus of 19th century ghosts. They are all Chinese Canadians. Our conductor is Mary Chung, our stage director is Debbie Wong, and you get the idea. It's an attempt on our part, in our time, to confront the vicious Canadian history of racism visited upon the men who came here to build the railway, but were not allowed to bring their family, and in order to get in at all, had to pay a head tax unique to the Chinese race, had to suffer the indignities of the Exclusion Act, unique to the Chinese race in our country, and who nonetheless endured. They endured. And we honor them with this story. Maddie has written a most moving and beautiful story about family, about love, and about survival in our neighborhood, in our Chinatown, in the last 120 years. Alice has complemented it with gorgeous, winsome, challenging, and extraordinarily eloquent music that refines and elevates the text, whose poetry has already been elevated by Maddie. I hope you'll come. I hope you will join us. It begins with a Mokyu song, sung by the narrator of the piece, who is herself a Hoisan singer. She is the very first person you will see on stage. About roughly 30% of the show is sung in Taiwanese, the rest in English. It is not, however, I should say, in respect to what you were arguing today rightly, it's not a Cantonese opera. We do not pretend it is a Cantonese opera. It is a 21st century opera with allusions to, respect for, acknowledgement of, and belief in the simple human truth that music has universal eloquence. And if we listen with unafraid ears, we can learn to love it all. And I say that as a descendant of the Scots on behalf of my reviled instrument, the bagpipes. Thank you.
once again to Professor Nancy Yunhwa for a very stimulating talk. And so I've been talking with Charles and see what UBC can do and to assist in production, maybe some of our students can attend that. And so like that music is part of the Namyang tradition, and some of our students in my Cantonese music class will know that. And so once again, thank you very much. So,
Thank you.